everyone. I'm really happy that this Lunch and Learn is about empowerment, because I think that if sponsors want to do the best job possible, this is something that they absolutely have to keep in mind throughout the entire process. And so just to be clear, what we're talking about with empowerment in the context of refugee sponsorship, it's about helping sponsored newcomers get to a place where they can make their own decisions and have control over their own lives. Wendy, I wonder if you can just talk a little bit about why this is important and why and how it's different from just helping people, which is what some people think sponsorship is about. Why is it more complex than that?
Yeah, well, I think while many of us, and I'm sure it's true of folks on the call, sponsor refugees and stay in touch with them for years. Like I first sponsored a Vietnamese family in about 1979, and I'm still, going to their kids' weddings and their children of their children and so on. So it is a very long relationship. But technically, the sponsor's legal and financial obligations end after 12 months. And for me, the goal during that 12 months is basically to ensure that people are on their own 2 feet by month 13 and can do what is needed to be successful in Canada. And that includes, language, employment, housing, understanding how to navigate the system. And everybody knows the expression that you can give someone a fish or you can teach them how to fish. And to me, empowerment is really about teaching people how to fish, because that's what's going to help them be successful in the long term. I think, as both Daryl and Maren mentioned, there is a power imbalance. And I've seen with my own 2 eyes, sponsors who are very well intentioned, very generous, very helpful, but they sort of view the refugees as, pet rabbits or something that they are going to care for. And while that generosity and kindness and support is invaluable, and we worked with Environics on a review of the Syrian refugee experience, and it's very clear, very, very clear, that privately sponsored refugees do better than government-sponsored refugees, because the sponsorship groups help them develop the social capital, the networks, the supports that are absolutely critical, and that helps minimize the trauma, facilitate connections, et cetera, et cetera. However, if you don't balance that desire to help people who have been victimized with the recognition that month 13 they're going to be on their own, you can actually create a certain kind of dependence that won't help them in the long term. And it's not ill intention. It comes from a really good place, but it can have unintended consequences.
Yeah, I think in all of Aura's training materials, I always put this image of a scale, because I think sponsors are constantly trying to balance these forces that are pulling them in different directions, right? On the one hand, we want to make people comfortable and happy, but on the other hand, we have to always be thinking about their long-term well-being. And after a certain point, a very well-defined 12 months, sponsors are supposed to be sort of out of the picture. But the reality is that it takes more work for sponsors to provide support in a way that helps people get to that place of being able to do things on their own. And so I think it means that, for example, I mean, I could just do an application for you and it might take me 10 minutes, but if I involve you in every step, and if there's translation required in those steps and explaining everything, it's not going to take 10 minutes, it's going to take longer. So I mean, I have a couple of examples, but Wendy, I wonder if you also have some examples of kind of ways in which, tangible ways in which sponsors could actively, while supporting sponsored newcomers, make an effort to sort of empower them in the process and help them be able to do things on their own.
Well, you actually gave a couple of good examples when we are talking earlier, which is, you know, you have a car, they don't have a car, they live in Mississauga, you know, me 15 minutes to drive to Mississauga to pick them up and drive them wherever they need to go. And in some cases, maybe that makes sense. But if they are going to be dependent on public transportation to get to work, to get to the doctors, to do all the things, the way to build capacity would be to actually go park your car and take them on the subway to show them how to navigate it so that next time they need to go somewhere, they can figure it out themselves. I mean, that's a really simple example. The other example is in terms of language, because people come with very, very different levels and facility with language. And, you know, I had some amazing experiences. Like, I will say that even though I've done lots of stuff in my life, my experiences in sponsoring refugees, and I did that with the Vietnamese family when I was quite young, and then I organized the Ryerson University Lifeline Syria Challenge, and we sponsored over 100 families, and they sponsored families and families. So that was a really big undertaking. And with the Afghan refugees, because of the barriers that have been put in place, we've only sponsored about 15 families. But nevertheless, some of the most inspiring cases have been where people come with 7 words of English and literally are lobbying for help to find a job, right? And the sense, you know, one of the things that I do feel very strongly about, and this is borne out by the research, is employment is one of the most important pathways to inclusion, not just because of the economic benefits that it brings, although there are those, but especially for men from some of the cultures that we deal with, the psychological benefits of working are really, really acute. Now, you can't apply that generally. Some people have trauma, they'll never be able to work, whatever. But in many cases, finding employment is critical to a sense of self, and I've seen with my own 2 eyes, you know, people like lobbying like crazy to get help in navigating the pathways to employment. And I remember even with the Vietnamese family, like the first jobs they could get were as dishwashers. And I remember Tan Nguyen coming to me and saying, you know, in her not great English, dishwashers don't make much money. We want jobs in a factory. And they advocated, and we were able to get them jobs in Magna, which hired a lot of Vietnamese refugees. There were benefits, there were pathways, there were all kinds of things. And, you know, that family now, there are PhDs, there are accountants, there are engineers. They went from dishwashers to basically middle class over a number of years. And so sometimes you will have people who are really clear about what they want to do, very highly motivated, and even with very limited resources will want to work. On the other hand, sometimes you have cases where, and I would say it's often harder where you're dealing with people who have been in elite roles. And so with the Afghans, for example, we have judges, we have members of parliament, we have physicians, we have people who were the elites in their country who don't have, for example, the language capacity or the educational credentials that are going to be recognized in Canada. And in those cases, it's much more challenging to try to figure out how to navigate what they want or think they want with what's realistic in terms of the context. And so that's a case where you can try to empower them, but if someone was a doctor in Afghanistan, the pathway to becoming a doctor in Canada is tough and it's highly competitive. If someone was a judge in Afghanistan, there probably is not even a pathway to being a judge in Canada unless they have high facility with English. They go back to law school and they work through a very complicated political process. And so it's very contextual. It really depends on the person, on their aspirations, and frankly, on their capacity, and the expectations in the context. So it's a constant process of navigating those different things. And you know, for me, a big piece is understanding what people's aspirations are, understanding what their expectations are, and helping them figure out how they can bridge the two, because sometimes the expectations are simply not achievable. And so trying to figure out how to moderate that is important. Similarly with language. So we were really lucky with Lifeline Syria. We had 1,000 volunteers, half of them were students, a lot of them spoke Arabic. With the Afghan refugees, we have fewer people with who are bilingual, and certainly with the Vietnamese family, we basically had no one who spoke Vietnamese or Mandarin. So that was a real challenge. But it's the same thing, trying to decide, like, when do you stick to English because people have to learn English, versus when do you rely on the brother or sometimes the child to act as a translator. And that's another very challenging thing to navigate, because we all know that facility with the language over the longer term is going to result in people being more successful, but you can't force somebody to speak English if they prefer to speak, you know, Arabic or Pashto or whatever. So it's again, it really depends. And I would say the third example is around gender roles and family roles. And that's really tough to navigate as well, because often we saw this, especially with Syrians, the norms around children, around babysitting, around what women do and don't do, really, really different. And you know, marriageability of girls, all those things, very complex and very different from, you know, legal expectations in Canada. Like, one of the biggest challenges we had was explaining to people they could not leave their children alone if they were under the age of 10, et cetera, et cetera. And so trying to figure out, like, we organized a women's group for the Syrians, and they got so much pushback from their partners, even though in our minds that was part of empowerment. We had to discontinue it because it was creating too much friction within the family. So navigating those competing values, how people treat their children, you know, corporal punishment is not accepted, and it's not legal in Canada, but you may be dealing with families who have very different patterns. So trying to figure out, like, there are boundaries that I would say have to do with safety and with legal activities, and to a certain extent norms, where you may want to push in a particular direction, but there are other things where you may not agree, but they have to make their own decisions. And those things are really tough to navigate in my experience.
Yeah. In your experience and in the experience of so many sponsors, you know, I worked with hundreds of groups over the years, and I think it's really challenging for sponsors to accept. I mean, right now we're talking about the right to self-determination, right? We're talking about sponsored refugee newcomers making their own choices and sponsors playing a supportive role in that, but that then means that they may make choices you don't agree with. And as long as they're not making those choices out of, ignorance about what options are available or lack of support in pursuing a particular thing, sometimes sponsors just have to sort of sit back and watch what they feel is a mistake. And I think that can be really, really hard. But we can't underestimate the importance of just asking people what they want. I think sponsors are often making all kinds of assumptions about what is best for people. And if we really are trying to do a good job as sponsors, we need to make space for the sponsored newcomers to be the ones to sort of articulate and identify what are the best ways that they might be able to benefit from the support of the sponsors during that year. And I think your point is so important, Wendy, about the different family members in, we often find that, excuse me, we often find that it's easiest to support, or in the context of this topic, empower the person who voices their needs or who can communicate the best in English. But if that's the father of a family, what about the mother? If it's the parents, what about the children? I remember from an RSTP training a million years ago, this example of a sponsor accompanying a mother to a doctor's office with her child, and the doctor saying, you can't feed the child juice. The child is getting too much sugar, so you need to water down the juice. And then they go home and the mother gives the kid a glass of juice. So what in that moment is the role of the sponsor? Is the role of the sponsor to, take away the juice, dump out half and fill it with water? No, the role of the sponsor is to make sure that the mother understood what the doctor said and then let the mother decide what she does. But like, this is one of the examples of why it's not so simple, because then where does that leave the child, right? And I think, I think it's can be really difficult for sponsors to navigate. One thing I want to mention is, what oftentimes we see sponsors, or sorry, non-family member sponsors working together with family member sponsors. And I think if I'm sponsoring my mom, I can try to get her to do something for herself, but if she tells me to do something for her, I'm just going to do it because she's my mom. It doesn't matter that I'm her sponsor. But if I'm sponsoring your mom, I have an opportunity potentially to encourage her to take another step out of her comfort zone, and in so doing, let that comfort zone grow a little bit in a way that you wouldn't. So I think there's also, as more and more sponsors partner with the families that they've sponsored to sponsor more family members, there's, in the context of empowerment, a special opportunity for the non-family members. Would you agree with that?
No, for sure. And that can cut both ways too, because there are, in terms of the gender dynamics, we've had some funny situations. Like, I would say most, not all of our sponsors are women. And when you're dealing with people from fairly patriarchal societies, often they just will not listen to anything that you say at all, even if it's, and this is beyond the, we want them to do something they don't want to do, the empowerment question. It's really making sure that they have appropriate information. And so sometimes it becomes, you have to think about messages and messengers. And that's where sometimes family members can be incredibly helpful, especially family members who have been here for a while and understand the systems in communicating. So it can work both ways. It's tension. Sometimes the family members are just going to go along with whatever the family wants. But sometimes the family members can be a really helpful conduit because they're trusted, respected, speak the language and so on. But it really just depends. Like I would say it's, you know, as much as we try to train people and coach people and provide, guidelines and whatever, every single case is unique, and every single, like I would argue, it's all contingent. It really depends a lot on who the sponsors are, what their capacity is, who the family is, and how that will play out.
Yeah, I think there's a lot to be said for sort of meeting someone where they are and then trying to take steps forward. And for some people, some people with some encouragement and support will be able to really, in many ways, be independent here. And some people with all the supports and encouragement in the world won't. And so it's also, I think, about adjusting sort of the expectation
On both sides.
The goal,
On both
yeah.
sides. Because I think one of the most destructive things, and I have to fight it in myself as well, one of the most destructive things is the poor little refugee syndrome, right? And the poor little refugee syndrome often breeds expectations that the poor little refugee will be grateful, nice, right?
Happy.
Warm and special.
Yeah.
And we have to, and this is true when we look at, victims of violence generally. There's nothing like, they're like all of us. So they're not going to be nicer. They're not going to be more grateful. They're not, in fact, they're likely to be traumatized. And the more that they had that they've given up, the more complex that situation, that dynamic is going to be. And the expectation of gratitude is one of the problems. And Maren, you've seen this. Like, I remember one of the cases in the training was someone was given a bunch of sheets and they were stained. They didn't want them. And I think the sponsor was, well, you're refugees, you should take what you get. But understanding that people are people, and I wouldn't want stained sheets. Why would they? That kind of stuff becomes, I think, really, really important. And, again, it has to be balanced with you're not going to get a walk-in closet and an in-ground pool. I'm sorry. But sometimes sponsors feel like refugees just should be grateful, take anything they're given, have nothing to say about it. And this extends as well to the financial management. And I know I've seen that become a bone of contention, where sometimes the sponsors have a sort of paternalistic view and think, oh, the poor refugees won't know how to manage their money and they'll spend all the money on cookies instead of, whatever you're supposed to be feeding your kid other than cookies. I personally like cookies. But where they're really controlling in terms of, here's your budget for food, here's your budget for transportation, here's your budget for rent and whatever, and don't hand over or don't develop financial literacy and capacity. And that is probably one of the most important dependencies to break, because they're going to have to manage their budget. And it's so important that they understand, money in, money out, legal obligations around leases, et cetera, and do it themselves. And figuring out at what point it may be that when they come for the first months, that's complicated, but certainly targeting like month 4 to have them managing their own finances, making sure that they're signing the legal agreements as well, that, all of those things become very important.
Yeah. I think one strategy, and again, it won't work with everyone, or it will look very different for different people, but the first time maybe I do it for you, then we do it together, then you do it, but I'm here, and then you do it, but I'm not there, but I'm available on the phone if you need help. And then the goal is you do it for yourself. And, if it is someone who just is not, whether it's because of language or life experience, going to be able to do that, then maybe empowering that person means connecting them to other sources of support where they'll be able to get that kind of assistance going forward, but it won't be you as a sponsor when that sponsorship period ends. What I've seen a lot is that sponsors do stuff for the people they've sponsored, and by doing that and not including them, they sort of shield them from the reality of life here. So you mentioned leases, and I remember an example of, we had somebody who signed as a guarantor on behalf of a family, but they didn't want the family to know that they signed as a guarantor. And I said, I understand you don't want them to know that you're doing this generous thing, but at the same time, they need to know that in order to get a rental place here, you need a guarantor. And if they don't understand that because you're just quietly, silently doing it in the background, then they're at a disadvantage when they move to their next housing and have to do it on their own. So yeah, again, knowing that there's no measuring stick to say at the end of the sponsorship period, everybody should be here, because obviously not everybody started at the same place. I think sponsors have to look at their particular situation and then try throughout the sponsorship period to take sometimes leaps, sometimes baby steps towards having people, doing things on their own. We are talking about people, not projects, right?
I think that's a very good way to put it.
I think we just have a minute or two left. Any final thoughts, Wendy?
No, as I said, I think it's one of the, regardless, and I've had, the good, bad, and the ugly across the groups that I've been involved with, but I really feel, and I say this as the child of a refugee, it is one of the most rewarding things that I've ever done, because when you watch over time, and I know when you're in the midst of it, it can, we're just currently scrambling to try to find accommodation and stuff for a bunch of people because the log jam is now breaking and all the families are coming. But Canada has such an incredible track record. Canada is a country of immigrants, and the success that the vast majority of people will achieve over time is one of the most rewarding things that I think I've ever seen. And I teach thousands of students, but it is that process of teaching them to fish and then kind of standing back. Like, I think all of you who have sponsored probably still have relationships, and occasionally people will be in a crisis and they need help, and you step in as you would with others. But it really does change people's lives, and there's no doubt that refugees who are privately sponsored do much better because of your support than those who come through the government assisted programs. So congratulations to all of you. And I know many of you have been repeat sponsors, but it really is invaluable.
Thank you. It's a perfect place, I think, to end.